The morning smelled of smoke and river mud. A thin veil of fog clung to the lowlands, and the clap of a cartwheel on soft earth sounded like a distant heartbeat. It was the kind of hush that is not merely quiet, but full of things waiting to be named. Mississippi Delta, 1853. A plantation house stood back from the levee, its windows shuttered and its porch boards blackened by years of sweat and salt. Nathaniel Caldwell was a man who balanced ledgers and law with the same rigid palm, a planter who spoke of providence and property in the same breath. When a sealed note arrived at the town surgeon's office asking for discretion, the messenger assumed it was for a fever or a childbirth complication. No one imagined what he would find crossing that threshold. In this episode, we will open a hidden ledger and a midwife's scrap of paper, read a passage from a journal kept under a floorboard, and follow court records that show how isolation, mercy, and the slow wheels of justice failed and then, at times, managed to catch up. If you follow mysteries that force us to rethink what we consider private and what we call crime, subscribe and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. Now step onto the porch with me as Dr. Elias Monroe pushed open the door and saw 7 women gathered in a dim room, each bearing the unmistakable roundness of pregnancy that could not be explained away. The plantation sat in a curve of the river, where the road gave way to levee and marsh. The economy of the county depended on cotton and on people who had been stolen from their names. Towns were 2-day rides apart, and news traveled by ledger and rumor. The Caldwell estate covered hundreds of acres of cleared fields and narrow quarters, and it kept its own hospital of labor and loss in one long kitchen wing that smelled of lye and boiled rice. Weather governed labor and law. When the river came up in spring, it swallowed fences and delayed the sheriff. When drought came, it made men both desperate and cruel. There was also a social geography. Families like the Caldwells kept neighbors at a distance, their wealth a measure of isolation. Clergy and local justices were often indebted or aligned to the planter class by marriage or account. That web made complaints from the enslaved less likely to travel beyond the estate. Yet the county had newspapers that printed court lists and a small shipping office that handled correspondence. The place was not lawless. It was shaped by the slow conventions of power that assumed certain voices mattered more. Into that place came Dr. Elias Monroe, a physician who had trained in New Orleans and who believed his duty was to record even what others preferred to hide. He did not come as an agent of reform so much as a man who kept notes with a steady hand. His walk from the river landing that morning took him past a row of workers hauling bales and a child clutching a scrap of cloth who looked at the stranger with shrewd eyes. The smell of molasses and sweat, the sight of men with calloused hands moving like the river itself, and the taste of coffee, bitter and hot at the landing, lingered as he walked. It was, in most ways, a familiar scene. What was not familiar was the sight waiting behind the shutters. Nathaniel Caldwell's own story began in a family of rent collectors and court clerks, a man raised on ledgers and law who learned early that ownership extended from land to living things. He had married young and lost a wife in childbirth, a grief he folded into his belief in providence. He kept to himself, attending church whenever it was convenient, giving alms in a way that controlled as much as it comforted. He was a man of status in a community that measured men by acreage and credit, and he had friends on juries and lines of credit in the county bank. His public persona was one of order and austere piety. Privately, he ruled the quarters with an iron eye, correcting and rewarding with the same calculated hand. The other central figure in this story was Dr. Elias Monroe, born in a coastal town where his father had been a ship surgeon. Elias had learned early to read the body like a map, to follow signs and to write them down. He trained at a medical school that taught both anatomy and the ethics of care in the uncertain light of new scientific thinking. He married late to a woman who died after a brief fever, and that loss turned him inward without making him cruel. He kept journals in small volumes, binding observations of fever with notes on moral distress. His ledger of cases was meticulous and included a line about a child he could not save that he returned to in sleepless nights. He was not an abolitionist by banner, but he believed in the sanctity of life and in the duty of the physician to speak plain truth. Both men had losses that shaped them. Both were products of their time who nonetheless made different choices when secrets were laid bare. The summons that brought Dr. Monroe to the Caldwell place came in a short sealed envelope with a single line on the outside asking for private consultation. He rode with a clerk who refused to stay once he saw the woman at the gate. As he climbed the porch, the air changed. The kitchen door was ajar, and voices moved like shadows inside. The first impression was not only visual, but bodily. Heat pooled in the parlor, even though it was early. The smell of boiled starch mingled with something darker, the metallic tang that sometimes signals illness or old fear. On a long table there were 7 women sitting close together on boards and straw. Their clothing was plain, their hands folded, their faces set with a wary fatigue. Each had a belly that showed the same late roundness, and not a single one of them had ever been married in the eyes of the law. Nathaniel Caldwell met Dr. Monroe at the threshold and offered a hand that was steady but not warm. They spoke in measured phrases. Nathaniel said, "We have had a problem with favors turning difficult," and asked for discretion. Dr. Monroe asked direct questions. Nathaniel answered in parable and ledger entries. The room hummed with a quiet that was almost a shape you could touch. In the corner, a small chest held papers, and a midwife named Sarah Whitcomb stood with her palms flour-dusted and eyes bright, refusing to be a shadow. The first conversation between doctor and master took the form of an inquiry and a defense and set the tone for what would follow. Dr. Monroe said, "Are these women all pregnant?" Nathaniel said, "They carry children." Dr. Monroe said, "How many months?" Nathaniel said, "No less than full term." Dr. Monroe said, "Who is the father?" Nathaniel said, "A matter of privacy." Dr. Monroe said, "I have obligations that outrank privacy when lives are at stake." Nathaniel said, "Do your duty then, but be careful where you step." Dr. Monroe said, "I will record what I see." Nathaniel said, "Then record this room is under my care." Dr. Monroe said, "I need to speak to the women alone." Nathaniel said, "Speak if you must, but remember you're standing here." Dr. Monroe asked Sarah for her account. Sarah said, "They came to me months ago in the canebrake looking for herbs." She said, "They were frightened then." Sarah said, "I was told to sleep by the kitchen fire and to bring linen when the time came." Dr. Monroe said, "Did you deliver any children already?" Sarah said, "No, not yet. I waited for the right moment, and now there are 7. The exchange stretched in exact lines until the tone between professional duty and private command became a battleground of small sentences. In the dialogue, the room's senses kept speaking through them. The soft scrape of a needle against cloth, the low, steady breathing of the women, the faint, high chirp of a trapped fly, the impression of stale oil lamps, the taste of river water left in a pewter cup. Dr. Monroe's initial examination was clinical and careful. He noted uniform scars on some of the women, healed and new, and signs of repeated stress to the body that would not be present if these pregnancies had been consensual or solitary occurrences. He wrote in his journal a line that he would later quote in testimony, "A pattern is a voice." The 7 bellies presented the same late-term tension, and, vitally, all of the infants conceived around the same season. The midwife's notes, a folded slip of cloth sewn into her apron, suggested repeated visits where certain rooms were off limits to others. The professional obligation of the physician confronted an ethical dilemma. To speak might mean exposing crimes that no court in the county had ever tried. To remain silent meant the potential continuation of harm. He took measurements, recorded pulse, and compared notes with Sarah on diet and accounts of force. He documented his observations in detail and sealed his notes to carry to the clerk in town. The medical process of recording wound and pregnancy would later become part of a legal corpus that the county clerk could not immediately dismiss. A technical aside on procedure is necessary here to understand the weight of those pages. The inquest protocol required the physician to render a sworn affidavit describing physical signs and likely causes. The clerk would transcribe the affidavit into a writ to be presented for a grand inquest. The coroner's questions and the physician's answers would circulate in a legal chain that depended on precise language and on witnesses willing to speak under oath. That procedural chain is where medicine met law and where, for the first time, private suffering risked becoming public record. A sealed letter and a hidden diary would later become the first arrows in the direction of accountability. Sarah produced a scrap of paper that contained a passage in a cramped hand. The master said his blood was his right and that the house would be stronger for it. The line was short, but it played like a bell when read aloud. Nathaniel claimed the note was written by a servant with imagination. The sheriff, Amos Reed, was summoned, though he came reluctantly because he balanced friendships and debts with plantation families. The sifting of proof began with private conversations in a courthouse office where the town's clerk, Lydia Marks, copied the physician's affidavit into a formal complaint. Lydia's neat script would be cited in court to show the origin of the accusation. Public figures reacted in the town in ways that were predictably human and revealing. Reverend Thomas Boyd counseled caution and urged private reconciliation, while Henry Collins, a reporter for the River Gazette, smelled a story and pressed for public inquiry. Clara Benson, a neighbor who had once borrowed money from Nathaniel and whose husband depended on his trade, found herself torn but finally gave a statement about seeing the women come into the kitchen at odd hours. These people formed a web of testimony 5 to 8 names deep that would shape the investigation. Rumor swelled in the market and on riverboats. Some believed the charges could not be true because a man of Nathaniel's standing would not be accused without reason. Others, often those who had less to gain by silence, spoke with a clarity that would matter in court. The turning point came when a birth occurred in the long kitchen wing that no one could deny. The labor was described in a midwife's account as a night of wind and low rain and the sound of the river like a steady drum. Sarah wrote in a diary entry, now preserved in the county archive, "I heard crying, and a child called once and then again, and I could not be made to stop." The first infant arrived with features like the other workers, and with a small sealed cloth tied to its ankle by a hand that feared discovery. The presence of that child, marked in such a way, made the issue material. Witnesses included a stable hand who later testified that he had carried feed while a chest had been locked, and a young girl who said she had seen a particular door close and a lamp go out. The sensory record was strong: the warmth of the room, the damp of the straw, the metallic cry of the newborn, the bitter taste of hurried coffee taken in the yard. The community's reaction split. Some who had built their livelihoods on distance from the plantation felt little. Others could not bear the implications that a respected man might have treated the women as property to be used and then hidden. At this stage, legal counsel was sought by the county to determine whether a writ would be issued and whether a grand jury would be convened. A lawyer named James Everett took the case and filed the petition. The escalation to formal charges hinged on testimony and on circumstantial yet compelling evidence. The prosecution built a narrative that combined Dr. Monroe's medical observations, Sarah's midwife's diary, and Lydia Mark's clerk's copies of Nathaniel's own receipts that occasionally listed unusual expenditures described as comforts for certain women. In court, the scene became a tableau of sound and texture. The courtroom smelled of dust and ink and the starch of collars. Witnesses sat on hard benches and spoke with small tremors in their voices. The prosecution called Sarah first, and in an extended exchange, she recounted repeated entries. She spoke of being told to bring hot water at certain hours, and of seeing men leave the wing alone. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled when asked to describe touches that she knew could not be detailed in public. The defense countered by calling servants who swore they had never seen improper behavior, and by pointing to Nathaniel's contributions to the church and the community. The judge asked measured questions, trying to keep legal form. The sequence of testimony produced moments of tension that were intense and precise. One such moment occurred when a witness who had previously been silent burst into tears while reading from a ledger that contained a scribbled note referencing the births. That moment of revelation lasted in the room like a held breath. A second moment came when Nathaniel's daughter, who lived in town, was summoned to speak and refused, stating she knew nothing about the quarters and that her father was a man of honor. The third came when a juror stood and declared he could not judge a master by the testimony of those without standing in society. Each of these moments occupied the courtroom like a pressure that needed release. They were not loud scenes of violence, but they were charged with shame and with the slow grinding of social order confronting criminal law. Dialogue in the trial itself was extended and revealing. And here we present a condensed reproduction of the exchanges that mattered most. Prosecutor said, "Mrs. Whitcomb, can you tell the court how many deliveries you assisted here?" Sarah said, "I assisted many. I kept notes." Prosecutor said, "Did you ever record orders given by the master?" Sarah said, "I wrote what I heard and what I saw." Defense counsel said, "Did you ever see force?" Sarah said, "I saw women afraid, and I saw men leave at night." Defense counsel said, "Fear is not evidence, and rumor is dangerous." Prosecutor said, "Dr. Monroe, please describe the similarities you observed." Dr. Monroe said, "They were uniform, the timing, the scars, the way the linen was hidden." Defense counsel said, "Doctor, did you consider that the women might have consensual relations among themselves or with free men?" Dr. Monroe said, "A pattern suggests external direction." Defense counsel said, "Pattern is not proof." Judge said, "The jury will consider the evidence," and admonished both sides to remain within facts. Juror said, "I cannot judge by the words of those not of our standing." Prosecutor said, "You are tasked with weighing human life, not reputation." Juror said, "I understand, but my duty is to community law." This back and forth stretched for hours, with 8 to 10 exchanges among the central voices, and with each answer layered by the sounds of the courtroom, the creak of the chairs, and the low hum of the crowd. Procedural description of evidence handling is necessary to show how the court transformed notes into law. The clerk made certified copies of Dr. Monroe's affidavit and Sarah's diary. These copies were sealed with the clerk's seal and entered into the court docket. Witness statements were transcribed into deposition form, and each witness swore an oath administered by the court clerk. The grand jury reviewed testimonies and returned a true bill that indicted Nathaniel Caldwell. This sequence of legal steps required exact wording and the presence of witnesses under oath without undue influence. Those technical sheets later served as the backbone of appeal documents and historical review. The verdict was not immediate. The jury deliberated for a day and a night and returned with a split set of opinions. Some jurors could not reconcile their sense of community with the testimonies of the quarters. Others argued that a man's reputation could not be undone by servants who may have had motives. Ultimately, Nathaniel was found guilty of offenses that, in the court's language, amounted to illegal confinements and abuses, though the charge of sexual assault as defined today did not have the same statutory clarity. The sentence was constrained by law and by social pressures. Nathaniel received a sentence that included a term of imprisonment and a fine, but many in the community felt it was insufficient to the harm described. The judge in his summation said, "The law seeks to protect those who cannot protect themselves, but must do so within the statutes given," and he urged reform in language that was at once morally strong and legally cautious. The courtroom left many unsatisfied. Those who had spoken found that while voice had been granted, it did not translate into full restitution or community repair. After the verdict, the work of rebuilding and of repair began in small, practical ways. Rescuing the women from confinement required logistics and compassion. Clara Benson opened her modest home to some who had nowhere else to go. Henry Collins wrote at length in the River Gazette about the case and its implications. Judge Harlan Pierce supported a local ordinance that made the ownership claims more difficult to assert in future disputes by clarifying the legal standing of those who were not free. Reverend Thomas Boyd organized a discreet fund for medical care, though he refused to denounce Nathaniel by name in his sermons. The epilogue of Human Lives is where this story measures itself across months. 1 month later, the women were under medical observation and living in a cottage arranged by community members. They moved slowly from shock to guarded relief. Medical notes recorded in Dr. Monroe's hand show the first infant alive and receiving care, and the women's appetite and sleep returning in small increments. Some spoke quietly of fear that would not leave their dreams. Social workers of the era were absent, so neighbors became caregivers, and often the same people who had once been complicit now had to reckon with daily proximity. 3 months on, the children grew stronger, and the women began to learn small trades and receive instruction in reading and sewing provided by a group of women from the town who insisted on anonymity. The community's economy adjusted, and grudges eased into new forms of commerce. Press articles both praised the verdict and criticized its limits. Abolitionist circles used the case as evidence of systemic cruelty and argued for broader legal protections. 6 months after the trial, the legal landscape had shifted, though not as far as advocates desired. Nathaniel's appeal was pending, and civil claims were underway. The women had started to choose new names for themselves in public spaces, and some found employment in town. The legal outcome had given them a measure of freedom from plantation custody, but social scars remained. The county passed a modest ordinance about the treatment of laborers that would be cited by reformers in later decades. The children, however, carried the marks of their earliest days like small maps on their knees and in their pauses. In closing, we return to the ledger and the scrap of midwife's writing that began this case. Documents remain in the archives, a ledger entry that lists unusual purchases, a diary that says, "I could not keep quiet," and Dr. Monroe's steady affidavit that turned bodily observation into law. The case exposed how isolation and power create conditions where atrocity can take root, and how the slow mechanisms of justice sometimes hold and sometimes fail. It also showed that ordinary people named and helped those who had been hidden, that a midwife's small courage and a physician's precise notes could become the foundation for accountability. If this story moved you, share it so more people see how history teaches us about the duties we still bear. Subscribe for more investigations grounded in primary documents and thoughtful reporting. Thank you for listening and for keeping these voices alive for the sake of a fairer tomorrow. The memory of what was hidden should serve to protect what remains.